Hello and welcome to the History of Japan podcast, episode 558, The All-Seeing Eye, Part 5. On October 12, 1960, Japan's voting population got to see the consequences of conspiracism broadcast live over the airways. Hibiya Public Hall in Tokyo was host on that day to a televised debate for the upcoming general elections planned for November, which had just been called by the new Prime Minister Ikeda Hayato as a way of shoring up his own mandate within his badly fractured Liberal Democratic Party. Ikeda, you see, had just replaced the previous LDP Prime Minister Kishi Nobusuke, whose career had been absolutely destroyed by a series of protests driven by Kishi's own handling of the renewal of the US-Japan Mutual Security Treaty. Kishi had attempted to force the treaty through the Diet, the Japanese parliament, with minimal debate in order to score a big foreign policy win, but underestimated how much pushback his behavior would cause. Massive protests rocked the country as a result of Kishi's actions, and in particular, Kishi ordered cops into the Diet building to break up a sit-in by the opposition Japan Socialist Party, which was trying to block the treaty, and then called a vote to ratify it after every single socialist member of parliament had been physically ejected from the building. This did work. The treaty was ratified, but it destroyed Kishi's career. The specter of police entering the parliament building to clamp down on opposition was just a bit too much of a pre-1945 vibe, so to speak, for a Japanese population that was well aware of how new and fragile its democratic rights actually were. And so Kishi had resigned his leadership of the ruling Liberal Democrats, and the new Prime Minister Ikeda Hayato had decided to call an election in hopes of being able to shore up his own rather fragile support. One has to imagine that the leaders of the two biggest opposition parties, the Democratic Socialist Party's Nishio Suehiro and the Japan Socialist Party's Asanuma Inajiro, were feeling pretty good about all of this. Sure, Asanuma in particular didn't love the new security treaty with the US. It tied Japan very closely to America in the Cold War, and Asanuma, as a socialist, had a lot more sympathy for the Soviet and Communist Chinese side of things, but still, the whole thing had been an embarrassing spectacle for the ruling party. If Asanuma played his cards correctly, there was a decent chance he could capitalize on the momentum to pick up more seats in the Diet, or even win outright. The debate started with a speech by Nishio Suehiro, someone Asanuma was not terribly fond of, as Nishio's Democratic Socialists had broken away from Asanuma's party over the whole security treaty mess. Nishio, unlike Asanuma, preferred the American side of the Cold War. But then it was Asanuma's turn to speak. Asanuma first came to the podium at 3 p.m. local time, but it took 5 minutes for him to be able to start speaking. Members of extreme right-wing groups deeply opposed to Asanuma and the socialists began to heckle him so loudly that Asanuma was inaudible even to the microphone-wielding reporters in the front row. The moderator, provided by Japan's National Broadcasting Service, NHK, had to interrupt and call for calm and make Asanuma start over several times. Finally, at 3:05, Asanuma was able to get his speech going in earnest, and what came next is probably one of the singularly most famous moments in the history of post-war politics. Asanuma made it about one sentence into his speech, in essence accusing the LDP leadership of trying to downplay their own mistakes in the last few years, in the hopes of salvaging something out of the next election, before he was interrupted. A young man dressed in a blazer over a school uniform rushed the stage and slammed into Asanuma, driving a wakizashi, a type of short sword, into the socialist Diet man several times until he was restrained. Asanuma was rushed to the hospital, but there was nothing to be done. He died en route to the emergency room. The assassin who was promptly arrested was a 17-year-old boy named Otoya Yamaguchi, who had left behind a manifesto explaining his actions. Quote, "You, Asanuma Inajiro, are planning to turn Japan red, although I bear no grudge against you as an individual for the stances you have taken in your role as leader of the Socialist Party. I cannot grant you forgiveness. I shall hereby become the instrument that brings down heaven's judgment upon you." Yamaguchi would commit suicide in his prison cell before he could be put on trial. His last act before hanging himself was to use his prison-provided toothpaste to inscribe the cell walls with Shichise Hokoku, roughly "would that I had 7 lives to give for my country," which is a slogan associated with the famous samurai Kusunoki Masashige, as well as Tenno Heika Banzai, long live the emperor. Prior to his death, it had come out that Yamaguchi had been associated with one of Japan's most infamous political parties, the Aikokuto, or Patriotic Party, of Akao Bin. Akao was a self-described admirer of Adolf Hitler who believed that Japan's post-war democracy had to be overthrown and the pre-war imperial government restored to power. Yamaguchi had resigned from the Aikokuto prior to the assassination to avoid implicating its leaders, but his actions, and especially his claim about Asanuma's plan to turn Japan red, were vintage Akao. Because Akao Bin, like many other members of the extreme Japanese right, was obsessed with a conspiracy theory in 1960 that had roots going back several decades, that Japan was under siege by communism. Now, we did a whole 2-parter on Japan's post-war extreme right with Akao as the main subject not that long ago. It's episodes 545 and 546 if you want to go take a look. I'm not going to rehash all of that here because Akao, after all, was only one of the voices parroting this idea, and it's the idea of the communist plot that I find interesting. Of course, I would be remiss not to note that, like a lot of other conspiracies we've talked about in this miniseries, there is a kernel of truth here. There were, in fact, committed Marxists in Japan who genuinely wanted to bring about the revolution, and indeed by 1960 they had given it, so to speak, the old college try. In 1950, inspired by the events of the previous year when Mao Zedong's Communist Party had successfully seized control of China's mainland and proclaimed a new People's Republic of China, extremist wings of the Japanese Communist Party had attempted to launch their own revolution. And as you have probably noticed, if you've gone to Japan any time in the last 70-ish years, it didn't go very well. Japan in 1950 was not in fact anywhere near as unstable even after the Second World War as China was after a century of war, rebellion, and invasion, and a bunch of radical Japanese university students, for the most part, were not the battle-hardened soldiers of Chairman Mao's Red Army. In reality, the revolution failed completely and accomplished little more than tanking the popularity of the Japanese Communist Party and tossing it into the political wilderness for the next decade plus. The Socialist Party, meanwhile, was frankly too politically divided to even manage to consistently win elections, let alone foment the revolution. Without going too much into the weeds here, Asanuma's plan to turn Japan red notwithstanding, he had to spend a lot more time and energy keeping the various wings of the party from splintering and fighting each other than actually, strategizing the inevitable collapse of capitalism or whatever. And given that, as I mentioned earlier, the Democratic Socialist Party had broken away from the mainstream by 1960, he didn't always succeed. Meanwhile, while the decade of the 60s saw radical Japanese students attached to the communists and socialists and other left-wing parties, engaging in some pretty vicious street fighting, it was mostly street fighting against other left-wing groups, and none of those forces were ever really a threat to the establishment beyond smashing up some university buildings with 2x4s. Unpleasant, sure, but not exactly the first step to waving the red banner over the imperial palace. What I'm getting at here is that, again, there's a kernel of truth. There were very serious Marxists in post-war Japan who did want a revolution. But once again, we have a very curious leap in our story here because you'd have to be ignoring basically all of the evidence to actually believe the communist conspiracy was a serious threat. And just to head off a certain argument at the pass, I imagine there's a few folks listening right now who are thinking I'm making one of the cardinal mistakes of history, using my knowledge of how the story ends to inform my analysis. In other words, I know, we all know, Japan has not undergone the revolution, and I am allowing that knowledge to shape my analysis. I'm proceeding from the assumption that because things turned out that way, turning out that way was inevitable. But honestly, I don't think that's what I'm doing. Japan's government was not, as I understand it, ever seriously vulnerable to revolution. That would require something like the state losing a substantial proportion of support from the people and the armed forces. At no point was there ever a hint of left-wing radicalization in the Japan self-defense forces, and indeed, that I know of, The only attempts to infiltrate the military during the post-war era came from the extreme right wing. Those were largely busted up by the National Police Agency before they could even get anywhere. Similarly, while there were some very angry people in Japan during, say, the 1960 Security Treaty protests, that anger was always directed at the behavior of Prime Minister Kishi, not at the system as a whole. Indeed, one of the reasons that these protests actually ended in a further split in the Japanese political left was that socialists and communists both tried to direct public anger against the treaty into a more wide-ranging rejection of the entire post-war system, weren't able to do so, and could never agree on why. All of this is, I think, pretty intelligible to any clear-eyed analyst today, and probably also in 1960, so no, I don't really think there's a case to be made that there was ever a serious threat of revolution in Japan. The only point where things were arguably maybe bad enough, where confidence in the system was low enough, was right after the end of World War II in 1945 when the whole country was in tatters, but at that point Japan was also occupied by an American military that was not exactly going to roll over in the face of communist uprising. Speaking of the American occupation, the occupation actually has a pretty important role in promoting this conspiracy theory, but before we get to that, we should talk about this conspiracy theory before World War II and take a moment to remember our framing. One of the books I started talking about right at the beginning of this mini-series was Colin Dickey's Under the Eye of Power, a history of how conspiracy has shaped American history, and Dickey makes the argument that the main role of conspiracy theories in politics is as a tool of the political reactionary. So if you don't know that term, a reactionary is someone who reacts against political change. It dates back to the French Revolution. Reactionaries opposed the revolution and wanted to work to bring back the monarchy of France in some form. More broadly, a reactionary is someone who opposes political change and wants to see things go back to how they were in some form or another. Generally, this is a type of right-wing politics, though there can be left-wing reactionaries. For example, a Russian Stalinist is arguably a sort of reactionary. According to Dickey, conspiracism is a tool that reactionaries make use of to discredit social change. So, for example, a reactionary in 1950s America might be upset about the advance of the civil rights movement and its opposition to the hatefully racist policies of the Jim Crow South, and thus advance the idea that, for example, Martin Luther King Jr. was an agent of the Soviet Union trying to destabilize the United States in order to discredit the civil rights movement more broadly. And yes, by the way, that is a thing that actually happened. Now, I don't know that this necessarily applies to every conspiracy out there, but certainly when a conspiracy theory is advanced by those with political power, it is very often, as Dickey talks about, for reactionary purposes, and I think the claims of a grand communist conspiracy, which stretch back in Japan all the way to the dawn of the 20th century, fit that mold exactly. You see, for much of the pre-1945 period, communism was the ideological boogeyman of Japanese imperial government. As early as 1900, the Imperial Diet passed labor laws curtailing the organization of labor unions, specifically because of concerns they would be infiltrated by communists. The founding of Japan's own Communist Party in July of 1922 resulted in an almost immediate organizing ban. My old teacher used to joke there were probably more police informants than actual communists at that first meeting. Probably most importantly, the ideological fear of communism was the rationale for one of the most important laws of pre-war Japan, the euphemistically named Peace Preservation Law of 1925. The Peace Preservation Law made criminals out of, quote, anyone who forms or knowingly participates in groups whose goal is to deny the system of private property or to change our national essence, and even contained the absolutely bonkers provision that it applied everywhere in the world, not just in Japan. It became the linchpin of the legal attempts to crack down on dissent during the 1920s and 1930s, one of the key enablers of the military regime that would come to dominate politics. And it exists because of this Japanese Red Scare, as we might call it, which would in turn last until the late 1960s, by which point only the absolute craziest of true believers could still argue with a straight face that communism was any sort of threat to the Japanese status quo. As a conspiracy theory, the Japanese Red Scare was advanced by reactionaries in service of their political agenda, and to understand how that works, let's look at one particularly well-known example, Baron Hiranuma Kiichiro, who was a major figure in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, and one of the foremost anti-communists in the Japanese government during this time. Hiranuma was born to a low-ranking samurai family in 1867 and trained first as a lawyer and bureaucrat in the new imperial government's justice ministry. He made his name with a series of high-profile anti-corruption cases, but really became prominent in 1911 when he served as the chief prosecutor for one of the most spectacular cases, the so-called Great Treason Incident. This was an absolute scandal when it came out, a plot busted up by the National Police Agency in 1910 to assassinate none other than the Meiji Emperor himself. 26 people, 25 men and 1 woman, were rounded up and tried for involvement in the plot, many of them using very circumstantial evidence, with all the trials taking place in a closed court with limited press access. Anarchist assassinations were, of course, very much a thing during the early 20th century. Violent anarchism was much more current at that time, and several prominent political figures, from the American and French presidents William McKinley and Sadi Carnot, to the kings Umberto of Italy and Carlos I of Portugal, had been killed by anarchists in the last few decades before the Great Treason Incident. But on the flip side, it is fairly clear that police and prosecutors like Hiranuma seized the opportunity to go after anyone with anarchist leanings, not just those actually connected to the plot, as a way of suppressing left-wing politics in Japan. However, by the late 1910s, the political left was resurgent once again, driven in large part by the success of the October Revolution in Russia and the founding of what became the Soviet Union. Hiranuma was deeply concerned, particularly as he saw left-wing movements picking up speed on university campuses. He helped to organize a counter-movement, the Kokokudoshikai, roughly Association of Comrades of the Imperial Land, on several college campuses, including the nation's most prestigious, Tokyo Imperial University. In 1911, he helped to destroy the career of one of Tokyo University's professors, Morita Tatsuo, a scholar of economics who'd committed the grave sin of publishing an article sympathetic to the ideas of the Russian anarchist Peter Kropotkin. Hiranuma secretly paid students from the Kokokudoshikai to protest the publication of the article, which had previously been approved by government censors as an academic exercise that therefore did not violate Japan's laws. Hiranuma then used the protests as an excuse to prosecute Morito, who ended up being fired, convicted, and given a 1-month suspended prison sentence. The case turned into a lightning rod around questions of academic freedom in the empire, but ultimately conservatives like Hiranuma won out, despite accusations even then, which proved to be true when Hiranuma's papers were open to the public after World War II, that he had set up the whole thing and worked to sway opinion against the subversive intellectual Morito, while bullying Tokyo University's faculty into going along with it. By the 1920s, Hiranuma had racked up enough of a public profile to become a privy councillor to the emperor himself and a member of the upper house of the National Diet. He was actually one of the ones who helped push through the peace preservation law in 1925 as a necessary counterbalance to the radical potential of letting all men vote, not just the ones who paid a certain amount in taxes. Otherwise, of course, the plebes might be misled and use their voices irresponsibly. Hiranuma also founded the Kokuhonsha, or National Foundation Society, an extreme right-wing political movement that helped radicalize many who would then go on to be involved in the post-war extreme right. He also cultivated political alliances with radical members of the military who hated civilian government for its tendency to put limits on their power, and in the bureaucracy. Many bureaucrats felt the same way and wanted to be able to plan economic policy independent of political pressure. Not terribly shockingly, Hiranuma was also an ardent admirer of both Benito Mussolini and Adolf Hitler. In 1939, when he was finally able to secure an appointment as Prime Minister of Japan, the New York Times described Hiranuma as, quote, nearer than anyone else to being the Japanese Hitler. I would quibble slightly with the New York Times analysis, but not in a way that makes Hiranuma look very good. To be sure, Hiranuma was a bit more concerned with respectability and not as extreme as some on the Japanese right. For example, the Kokuhonsha is only confirmed to have been involved in one incident of outright violence, when its members helped bust up a strike in Hamamatsu in 1926, but Hiranuma was happily associated with many not-so-respectable rightists who were more than willing to use violence. For example, he was an advisor to the extremely violent Kenkokukai, the right-wing group founded by Akao Bin, the same guy who, after the war, called himself Japan's Hitler, founded the Aikokuto, and radicalized Yamaguchi Otoya into killing Asanuma Inajiro on live TV. The Kokuhonsha's own magazine published countless articles from the most extreme members of the right-wing spectrum in Japan, calling for a kakushin, a renovation, code in essence for junking the pre-World War II constitution via revolution, because even with its authoritarian tendencies, they felt it was still too Western and too liberal, and installing direct imperial rule. The writers in the magazine railed against the League of Nations and international labor, and many of them, taking their cues from Hitler and the Nazis, explicitly tied these things to an international Jewish conspiracy. And that, by the way, was not a fringe part of the Japanese right. One of the magazines Hiranuma helped support as a privy councillor, Daito Bunka, Culture of the Great East, published a chart in 1927 that showed all the concerns of modern conservatives, from anti-monarchists to socialists to communists to women's liberation, emerging from an immense Jewish conspiracy. One of Hiranuma's closest associates, Army Lieutenant General Shioda Nobutaka, wrote several anti-Semitic pamphlets based on ideas he cribbed from Adolf Hitler, and Hiranuma wrote a glowing preface to at least one of them. Admiral Kato Kanji, another radical military man who Hiranuma helped promote, railed in his writing against the Judaization of Japanese society by intellectuals who were the primary obstacles to his vision of a new Japan standing up to the West. All this despite the fact that there were maybe a few thousand Jews in Japan altogether during this time, but of course anti-Semitic conspiracies, like all others, don't really have much to do with the people they're actually supposedly about. This particular type of rhetoric is a classic example of what we call Judeo-Bolshevism, the belief common among many fascists that communism and left-wing politics in general were a Jewish conspiracy. Adolf Hitler was a big proponent of this theory, so it's not surprising Hiranuma was too. Still, while Hiranuma was willing to parrot the rhetoric of other fascists, anti-Semitic ideas don't have quite the currency in Japan that they historically have had in Germany, and so Hiranuma was mostly concerned with liberalism, anarchism, and communism, and other subversive ideologies which he saw opposed to the pure rule of Japan's emperor. This was why he promoted the careers of men like Shioden and Kato, who by the mid-30s had largely sidelined him in turn. In fact, while Hiranuma did become prime minister in 1939, his premiership lasted less than a year, and after that point, he was pretty much sidelined politically. Thus, Christopher Spillman, in his essay on Hiranuma, notes that rather than being Japan's Hitler, quote, the Kokuhonsha and other conservatives played a role analogous to the likes of Alfred Hugenberg in Germany, the chair of the National People's Party who helped make Hitler chancellor and believed he could control the Nazis to his own ends. By undermining the legitimacy of the Weimar Republic, they paved the way for Hitler's rise to power, and like Hugenberg in Germany, who thought he would be able to control Hitler, Baron Hiranuma too deluded himself that he would be able to control Japan's radical bureaucrats and soldiers. And like Hugenberg in Germany, who was discarded once he was no longer useful to Hitler, so were Baron Hiranuma and his fellow conservatives, rendered largely irrelevant by the policies and actions of military men and bureaucrats who came to power in the late 1930s. After the start of the Second World War, Hiranuma Kichiro was largely relegated to the sidelines, as the military men he'd empowered as a bulwark against Jewish liberal communism proved remarkably uninterested in his advice. His main accomplishment after the end of his premiership in 1939 was to delay Japan's final surrender by several days because he objected to the terms of the Allied Potsdam Proclamation, which outlined Allied war goals for after the end of the Second World War, feeling that they left too little power in the emperor's hands. As he forced more and more debate on the terms, thousands more people died. He then spent the rest of his life in prison as a war criminal, before dying in 1952. Unfortunately, his political influence did not die with him. Men like Cao Bin carried his ideas into the post-war, and of course we've already talked about the results of that. What we haven't talked about, though, is the way in which this kind of conspiracism didn't just leak into the extremes of the post-war right, but the mainstream as well. So to simplify a very complicated moment of political history for time purposes, the dominant force in post-war Japan in terms of politics was the Liberal Democratic Party, and still is. It got its deeply uncreative name from a 1955 merger of two dominant conservative parties, the Liberals and Democrats. The politicians of the LDP would dominate Japan for decades to come, but for the first 15-ish years things were looking a little shaky. The devastation caused by defeat gave a big boost to the socialist and communist movements in Japan, as did the fact that the Americans allowed for a level of open organizing for these parties that the pre-war government never had out of a commitment to political freedom. For a while, the socialists in particular looked like a genuine political threat. In 1947, they were able to win a general election and had the backing of Japan's growing union movement, though their new government lasted only 10 months before they lost power in a new election. However, conservatives had an important ally here that would play a key role in keeping the communist conspiracy theory alive: the occupation government of Japan, run by the United States in the person of the Supreme Commander of the Allied Powers, General Douglas MacArthur. Even by the end of 1945, the growing rift in the wartime alliance between the Soviet Union and the United States was pretty clear. American leaders were concerned about growing socialist influence in Japan, particularly as the Chinese Civil War started to turn against the pro-American side. MacArthur himself was also a huge anti-communist, remarking in his later reflections on the occupation that, quote, "The single greatest political group as a medium of potential trouble for the occupation was the Japanese Communist Party, which was less a political party and more of a fifth column introducing alien ideologies into Japan." And so, after some initial waffling, did he want to come down too hard on the left, since he was considering a run for president when he got back to the United States? Ultimately, MacArthur decided to suppress the communist movement and to de-purge right-wing pre-war leaders who were willing to take a tough stance on communism out of his belief that he was saving Japan from revolution. He also promoted several men into his inner circle with similar beliefs, including, most importantly, Major General Charles Willoughby. Charles Willoughby is an interesting character, more than we can do justice to here, and I've actually debated doing a full episode on him, because he's not talked about that much for a guy who is, in my view, pretty important to how post-war history turns out. Willoughby was born in 1892 in the German town of Heidelberg. His birth name was Adolf Weidenbach, but after he came to the US and joined the American Army during World War I, he would end up changing it. After the war, he would stay on as an officer and military attaché in South America, before eventually becoming a part of the staff of Douglas MacArthur in Asia. Before long, he was MacArthur's chief military intelligence analyst. Thus, after the war ended, he was a natural choice to follow MacArthur to Tokyo and head G2, the section of the occupation government charged with intelligence affairs, including censorship of the media and the broadly defined realm of public safety. Willoughby, like his boss, despised communists and cultivated into his own inner circle the type of Japanese informants who would support his own prejudices about what the real threats to the occupation were. So, for example, one of his closest contacts was General Kawabe Torashiro, a former Imperial Army officer who'd been the intelligence chief for the Kwantung Army. If that name sounds familiar, it's because the Kwantung Army was the same unit that had, without authorization, invaded Manchuria in 1931 and set up a puppet government. Similarly, one of his other major contacts was Aresue Seizo, a former intelligence attaché to Imperial General Headquarters. Both men had committed horrific crimes in China, but Willoughby protected them from prosecution and encouraged them instead to collect information about communist subversion, information, of course, that they were happy to provide. Through these two men, Willoughby even became involved in a plot to assassinate the conservative Prime Minister of Japan, Yoshida Shigeru, who Willoughby thought was insufficiently tough on communists. He tolerated left-wing politics, and for Willoughby, that was a step too far. The plot was eventually broken up, but so far as I know, nobody involved in it, including Willoughby, ever faced any consequences for it. Ultimately, Willoughby's own military career would end in his disgrace because of the Korean War. He was an intelligence chief after all, and first he completely failed to foresee the North Korean invasion in 1950, and then, at the behest of his boss, doctored intelligence reports that suggested China would intervene to defend North Korea if the Americans invaded them. MacArthur wanted to pursue an invasion and the eradication of North Korea, and so Willoughby massaged the results he was getting to support the idea that China was not going to intervene. When the Chinese did, MacArthur then argued that America should just keep rolling forward and try and nuke Beijing, at which point President Truman fired MacArthur, and Willoughby resigned in disgrace. Charles Willoughby would spend the remainder of his life as an anti-communist organizer in the United States. That I know of, he never joined the John Birch Society, whose anti-communist crusade provoked the writing of the paranoid style in American politics, but he was involved in several groups like the International Committee for the Defense of Christian Culture that had ties to both the Birchers and parts of the early American right-wing militia movement. This guy, in other words, sucked a lot. That's what I'm saying. So why does that matter for us? Well, in part because the anti-communist conspiracies peddled by guys like Willoughby provided ready-made and very bad explanations of some of the radical actions of the 1950s. For example, on May 1st, 1952, Sohyo, Japan's largest labor union, set up a bunch of protests against the terms of the treaties which finally ended the American occupation, but which, for example, gave the American government unlimited rights to use bases in Japan without consulting the Japanese. Pretty dangerous given how hot the Cold War had just gotten in Korea. Sohyo organized over 300 protests across Japan, demanding that, since the country was now actually independent, it should, really be independent, with the largest taking place in the public plaza in front of the Imperial Palace in Tokyo. That plaza had been home to a yearly May Day rally during the occupation, but the new civilian government of Japan had just announced they would not allow a May Day rally inside the palace grounds. Of course, telling someone you can't do something is a great way to get them to do it, and the protesters stormed the barricades and had the rally anyway, at which point the police forced their way in too, fired some warning shots into the air, and went in with clubs. Hundreds were injured, 2 people died, and fleeing protesters destroyed swaths of American cars and property on their way home, and chucked 3 American GIs who happened to be walking nearby into the palace moat. Violence continued throughout the summer, including a couple of Molotov cocktails thrown at American soldiers. In retrospect, it's pretty obvious why this happened. The American treatment of Japan was very high-handed, treating the country like a vassal state. But admitting that would involve taking a close look at how American policy in Asia actually worked, and so instead the common wisdom in both Tokyo and DC among Americans was that communist agents in the pay of the Soviet Union had orchestrated the whole thing. Similarly, because guys like Charles Willoughby had perfected the career of right-wing politicians in Japan, men like Kishi Nobusuke were able to come to power. Prime Minister Kishi, the same person whose high-handed behavior triggered the riots of 1960, was also happy to promote anti-communist conspiracy theories to promote his own political agenda, both at home and to the Americans. For example, one of Kishi's main political goals early on was the destruction of Nikkyoso, the Japan Teachers Union, and one of his major political opponents. Kishi thus put into place new regulations to grade teachers on their merit, a ranking system Nikkyoso leaders correctly identified as set up in order to intentionally fail union organizers and provide cover for firing them. Kishi's justification was that the teachers were communist agents undermining Japanese children's confidence in their own country. For the same reason, he also brought back elements of the pre-war ethics curriculum, essentially a nationalistic indoctrination class baked into the school curriculum. A host of other actions Kishi undertook as a politician, from trying to expand the rights of the police to engage in warrantless surveillance, to promoting his revised security treaty with the United States, were supported using the argument that a conspiracy was attempting to overthrow the Japanese government and install a Marxist-Leninist regime. Americans in particular bought this rhetoric hook, line, and sinker. The American ambassador to Japan, Douglas MacArthur II, was so convinced that he had the CIA divert funding to the Liberal Democratic Party to support it in its fight against communism. And this is the flip side of the anti-communist conspiracies of the post-war, a very clear example of what Colin Dickey was talking about. Conspiracism as a tool by the powerful to defend their power, that's exactly how Kishi Nobusuke and his supporters used it. That it came with consequences, including right-wing violence, that was simply part of the price that had to be paid. That's all for this week. Thank you very much for listening. This show is a part of the Facing Backward podcast network. You can find out more about this show at facingbackward.com. Thanks again for listening, and I'll see you next week for what will actually be the 6th and final part of this miniseries. I promise, we're actually going to be done this time.